Raymond Winbush is the author of this book, Should America Pay? Slavery and the Raging Debate on Reparations. Good morning. Welcome to the Washington Journal program.
Morning, Steve.
Should we pay?
Yes. Reparations are as American as apple pie, and there's a history of reparations to several groups in this country. The most recent, which we all know about, it was in 1988 under President Ronald Reagan, where this country paid $1.2 billion to the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. So it's a consistent thread throughout American history and in international law as well.
Let me put one figure on the table. This is on page 313 of the book, in a series of conversations you did with people supporting and opposing the idea for education reparations, a budget of $128 billion.
Actually, those figures are small. We've got Richard America of Georgetown University, an economist, has said that the entire wealth in terms of unpaid labor by African Americans in this country is somewhere between $5 to $10 trillion. Another study that was done in Africa just a few years ago computed the entire cost of enslavement, extraction from Africa, minerals, everything, the entire colonialism, enslavement, at $777 trillion. So we're not talking about small numbers here at all.
Shelby Steele, who's included in the book that you edited, says, quote, today, 70% of all black children are born out of wedlock. 68% of all violent crime is committed by blacks, most often against other blacks. 60% of black fourth graders cannot read at grade level, and so on. When you fight for a reparational uplift, you have to fit yourself into a victim-focused protest identity that is once angry and needy. You have to locate real transformative power in white society and then manipulate white guilt by seducing it with neediness and threatening it with anger. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Steele and opponents of reparations do is oftentimes fail to connect historical dots, how things that were lead to things that are. And I think with regards to the impact, we want to feel as a country that somehow enslavement has no contemporary impact on African Americans. In fact, it does. And so when we talk about crime rates, when we talk about out of wedlock births and so forth, we don't connect those dots. The other thing I think is that many conservatives have co-opted the use of the term victim. You can be a victim of a tornado and rebuild. Rosa Parks was a victim in Montgomery in the 1950s, but she did something about it. So I think that the idea of victimhood is something that we need to reconsider, and we try to do that in the book.
If you support the idea for reparations for descendants of American slaves, 202-585-3880. And if you support the idea of reparations for those African Americans, 202-585-3881. Our email address is journal@cspan.org. The numbers will stay on the bottom of the screen. John Van Dyke is asking the question, who should provide reparations for the descendants of American slaves?
Right. It's an excellent question. And those who would provide it are those who live in the country right now. One of the biggest oppositions I've heard about reparations as a scholar is that people will say, well, my grandparents didn't own slaves. I had nothing to do with slavery. Or I came over here, my parents came over here at Ellis Island a few 50, 60 years ago. The fact of the matter is that I had nothing to do with the incarceration of Japanese Americans, as I said earlier, but I had to pay part of my 1988 tax dollars for what this country had done to them. The country owed the Japanese Americans an apology, and they gave the apology along with compensatory measures.
Again, those who oppose the idea of reparations should call the number 202-585-3881. How do you track, though, who would qualify for these benefits?
It's not as hard as people think. One of the things that Congressman John Conyers has called for is a study, and he's been calling for this study since 1989. Preceding any reparations payment are national studies and sometimes international studies about who should be compensated and so forth. So Congressman Conyers' bill, H.R. 40, is something that groups like in Cobra, myself and others are lobbying for so that a study can be done. But given modern technology, it simply is not as difficult as people might think who should get reparations payments.
Who contributed to this book?
Several people. We had over 20 authors, Deidria Farmer-Pellman, Yao Santwa Nzinga, a variety of teachers, educators, scholars, lawyers, and so forth.
Brandywine, Maryland, good morning for Ray Windbush.
make a couple of quick points. I think the idea of, I called on the support line, and I support the idea of some sort of recognition of the continuum of oppression and what the gentleman said earlier about what was affecting what is. But most importantly, I think the country needs to recognize that this is still a country where being white is an advantage. It always has been. That advantage is unearned. It has nothing to do with merit, hard work, or anything else. It has nothing to do with qualifications, which is always an issue where discussions of affirmative action take place. And that something has to be done about that.
Thank you, caller. And let me read you this email from a viewer in Alabama, Michael Miller, who says, isn't affirmative reparation actions enough for these American Africans? We've lowered qualification standards so they get preferences in college. Possessing darker colored skin gets them hired despite inferior aptitude. What else could they ask for?
Well, it's like I heard a person the other day said that, the United States recognizes it should do something, affirmative action being one of those things. It's ironic that two of the most vocal opponents against affirmative action during this past week, Clarence Thomas on his birthday last week opposed affirmative action, and George Bush, who was a legacy admit at Yale University when he went to school many, many years ago. Affirmative action has been cast as a racial issue, and in fact, it's an issue simply saying extend the net further. And so there's a little bit of disingenuous about people who say that haven't these people gotten enough, because again, I think Americans in general, and white Americans in particular, simply don't understand the history and their own connections, both directly and indirectly, to enslavement.
Good morning to Waterloo, Indiana.
Good morning. If by reparation you mean money payout, I'm very much opposed, because this will just aggravate the whole divide. However, I do think equal treatment for equal talents is a different story. And before you come up with any kind of conclusion, I think we're all going to have to get busy and do a bunch of family history to confirm whether we were or were not. I have some ancestors who came from Europe. I have other ancestors who lived in the South who didn't own slaves and moved away because of it. I have other ancestors from New England. So we all have to be able to substantiate, other than just holding out our hand and saying, me too. This might become very fashionable to be able to claim a black ancestor. It means you're going to get some money. So I think the whole situation needs to be analyzed very thoroughly.
Well, I agree with you, and I think that's why Congressman Conyers' H.R. 40 bill is so important in terms of doing a study on enslavement. But again, I think that one of the things you said, it may not be true, is that, we have no responsibility connected to enslavement. Again, I repeat the example. I have indigenous people in this country, Cherokees, Choctaws, and others have gotten reparations. And in the form that they have gotten, both in group and individual, I, as an American taxpayer, had to pay for that.
Next call is Cleveland, Ohio. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. I want to thank Mr. Windbush for his research and his determination in keeping this issue at the fore. I think the word Christian has been co-opted. The Christian Coalition, these people call themselves Christian, but they want to pick and choose the rights and the wrongs and use them for themselves to justify what they want. As far even as this war on terrorism, we have been, as African Americans, plagued by the Klan for 200 years. And then we went to Jim Crow and separate and unequal. And people don't know the history of the country. Oklahoma, back in the 1920s, the government, the whites in power, bombed the black areas as a show of white supremacy.
Well, I think what you said, especially your last point about Tulsa, Oklahoma, is very important. Even now, as we speak, there are two major lawsuits taking place about reparations. One is being litigated by Charles Ogletree of Harvard University for the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre that occurred in 1921. And the other one is taking place in federal court in Chicago, where Deidre Farmer Pellman and Conrad Will and the National Black United Front are suing some 30-something odd corporations for their complicity in enslavement of African Americans.
Our guest is a native of Cleveland. He currently lives in Baltimore. Ray Winbush earned his doctorate and master's from the University of Chicago. He is currently a teacher at Morgan State University. This email from Bedford, Texas says, I'm a Caucasian who favors reparations for the descendants of slaves. The U.S. government does have a duty to pay reparations if for no other reason than they played a part in the slave industry via the constitutional provision, Property Clause, which was a concession to the South to end the Civil War, which allowed slave owners to keep their slaves. And one point that this viewer brings up is the slave diet, which was notoriously poor and affected generations in terms of certain illnesses.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we include in the book, Steve, is a discussion about the health consequences of enslavement. We know for a fact that American gynecology was founded on the experimentation towards African women and who were enslaved in this country, and those operations were performed without sterilization or anything else of that kind. I think that what we do in America, Michael Eric Dyson, the educator, says that when it comes to slavery, we may well be called the United States of amnesia. We don't want to remember slavery. We want to remember the Alamo. We want to remember the Maine and other things like that, but we don't want to remember slavery. We want to talk about it. And I think reparations will also be a healing for this country in terms of getting blacks and whites talking more logically and truthfully about enslavement in this country.
Lawton, Oklahoma.
Yes, if we're going to achieve true racial equality in America, we're going to have to eliminate all of these laws that favor or discriminate against anybody because of their race. Now, the black race is favored at the present time by a number of laws, as is the Indians, and we need to eliminate all these laws that favor or discriminate because of race. Now, as far as slavery goes, it was a terrible institution, but most of the blacks who live in America today indirectly benefited from slavery by being brought to America and not left in Africa, where many of them would have starved to death, as many of them are still doing.
Well, this is not as amazing as some of your listeners might believe, that people actually have said to me, well, isn't it good that we were enslaved since we were brought from a continent that was undergoing poverty? And again, it shows the lack of understanding of African history and African American history. The fact of the matter is that civilizations such as Timbuktu, Songhai, and Ghana were flourishing beyond that of Europe during the Middle Ages, and that people want to forget about that and somehow jump to the incredible conclusion somehow slavery was good for African Americans. Again, I think that this is mostly based on an ignorance of American history as well as African history, which we all need to deal with.
Where is your family from?
My mother is from Kentucky. She was great-granddaughter of a slave owner in Kentucky. My father was relatives are from Pennsylvania with roots in Virginia.
This email from a viewer who said, I'd be for reparations if the Supreme Court did not just say it's legal to discriminate against white people.
Well, it's amazing those who are opposing, quote, discrimination against white people somehow have gotten religion about the racial past of this country. The fact of the matter is that, as Clayton and Bird have said in their book, American Health Dilemma, only about 11% of the time that African Americans have spent in this country have been, quote, free. The vast majority of this country's history has been based on overt discrimination and violence towards black folk. I mean, that's just a historical fact. And I think that now what we're trying to, believe is that somehow, as one of the callers said earlier, that there's a meritocracy here, that people get what they want because of hard work. In fact, that simply is not true. Discrimination still reigns in this country relative to African Americans, and it's something that's part of the very culture of this country.
HarperCollins is the publisher of the book Should America Pay? Our guest is Ray Winbush, who is the editor of this 325-page book, and we'll get a call from New York City. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Windbush.
Good
I would
morning.
like to say thank you, first of all, for your very articulate discussion. And I would like to say as well, as an African American, I lived in Switzerland for 10 years, and I found it very interesting how Europeans in particular, were more educated about the issues of the Africans in America and the issues within America as far as slavery are concerned, and where African people actually come from with reference to the Americas and the different parts of the world.
Why do you think that is, caller?
I believe it's because it's like he said, America wants to have a collective amnesia, and we have not been properly educated in this country about slavery, about how Africans arrived in America, and what actually transpired after that. We pretended that we just came from slavery. Our history books, as far as we were taught in Texas, where I grew up, there was probably 2 paragraphs about it, and that was the end of history as far as Black Americans knew. We were never articulate about it. We were never informed. We had no defense. So we're at the mercy of people like the gentleman who called 2 calls ago and said that he feels that blacks got a better deal coming from Africa and being drowned on ships and treated in the most dehumanizing manner. But we can obsess about the Israel question and what happened to the Jews with the German Holocaust.
No, I agree with the caller 100%. I think that, again, I was a member of a delegation that went to the World Conference Against Racism a couple of years ago in South Africa, and groups like December 12th out of New York and other groups, it was amazing to see Europeans talking about African history and African American history better than most Americans could and did. And I think that it's perhaps educational systems. We want to talk about the dumbing of America, but I'm really, as an educator, appalled at the lack of knowledge that we have about our own country, and particularly the history of African people in this country.
Along those lines, this is an email from Robert who says, Mr. Windbush, I am an African-American man and have been doing my family history. What I found in the archives of this country confirmed that my ancestors were slaves in North Carolina. I think that doing family research is a great way to find out who should receive reparations. Still, some people find it hard to let us find our ancestors by denying us access to records.
I couldn't agree with the caller more. One of the things that has just thrilled me as I've gone across this country with the book is to see African Americans who have collected incredible data, put it together, synthesize it, and can present an articulate story about their cases. There's many people who have written me, we have, and others. And that research is what's going to get reparations for African Americans in this country. And I believe that it's going to happen within 5 to 10 years as well.
Our guest has his own website, which is linked through cspan.org. It's RaymondWinbush.com. Next is a call from Romeo, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. Am I coming through all right?
Yes.
Okay. I think that this thing could have many threads. Let me mention a few of them. I think there was a gentleman sitting where you are who wrote a book on C-SPAN. I think it was prior to the 2000 election. He's sitting right where you are. Didn't he write a book? He was mentioning the remunerations and Conyers. Do you remember the gentleman?
We have talked about this in the past.
May have been Randall Robinson.
Anyway, I think that prior to the 2000 election, this has 1,000 threads. You know, as a World War II veteran, why couldn't men were killed and injured sue the Jews for money for saving them in World War II? Or we could go back and do our history and find many instances. But a monetary remuneration, I wouldn't be in favor of. But if you could specify an excellent education for black youth, I'm all for it.
If I understand the question, I think, again, that we need to really understand how reparations are a part of international law and a part of the law in this country with regards to certain groups. In fact, after you do the research and do the study, you will actually probably ask the question, why haven't Africans in America actually gotten reparations? Because so many other groups have. And not only, again, in this country, but around the world. One of the callers mentioned after World War II, the Nuremberg trials looked at, and many people that were Jewish and part of the Holocaust received reparations. There are lawsuits currently being prosecuted in South Africa for the evils of apartheid. And this is going to happen in this country right now. It's really a global movement that is very well articulated and very well legislated, as well as very well litigated.
Let me go back to your earlier point about those Japanese Americans who were interred in California and elsewhere during the height of World War II. It's been almost 140 years since the end of the Civil War. How do you administer something like this? How do you determine who gets what? Where does the process begin?
Well, it's the exact same way that we have broken treaties in this country with indigenous groups, the Choctaws, the Sioux, Cherokees, that go back even before the end of slavery. Some of these broken treaties go back as much as 200 years. But the administration is what has occurred with those groups, and the same thing can occur with Africans in America.
But specifically then, how do you determine who gets what?
Well, that's again, I keep referring to Congressman Conyers' bill, and that's why it's so important. He has said that we should set up a commission that would be funded by not that much money, about $8 or $9 million, that would study the impact of enslavement, as well as who gets the money, as well as the theory about whether or not it should go to groups of people, individuals, or both. And I really believe that it's going to go for like funds as well as individuals. It depends on the study, and it's almost premature to ask the question unless we have funded a study like that. And this is one of the things we try to do in this book, is try to advance the discussion on who gets the money.
I'm not sure if you can put this in terms of numbers, but how many slaves did we bring into this country?
Oh my God. The late historian John Henry Clark says we must begin the count at 30 million. One of my former professors, John Hope Franklin, said it's at least 40 million people. I estimate, in terms of extraction out of Africa, somewhere between 40 and 50. At the time of the emancipation, there were approximately 3.5 million Africans in this country at that time, and that was 200 years. So the estimates are very, very difficult. The best guesstimate is somewhere between, in this country alone, somewhere between 10 and 15 million people.
And how many African Americans today in the U.S., approximately?
Probably 85% of Africans in America today had ancestors who were enslaved.
Stover, Missouri, good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
My question to Mr. Windbush, do you and your group plan to go after the other slave trading countries, namely the Brits, the Dutch,
yes,
the Spaniards, the Portuguese, those countries that was really involved in the slave trade and helped bring the slaves to this country?
Absolutely. In fact, there was a meeting just about a month and a half ago in Amsterdam, and there are lawsuits that are pending now that are going to be prosecuted in the next 2 years against England, France, Portugal, Germany for Southwest Africa, known as Namibia. So these suits are all over the world, literally, at this point. So to answer your question is absolutely.
Boston, good morning.
Good morning. I have a question for the Mr. Windbush. Everything you're saying, I agree with you. I'm not racist or anything, but white folks seem to forget that we black folks paved the way in this country. We practically built this country up from the cotton fields to the railways. And if I know you probably visited Boston before, Boston has a large history of African Americans, migrating from the South.
Yeah.
But my thing is that I know a little bit of history of Lincoln when he, was the one that helped free the slaves. But I'm kind of nervous, but my thing is that where is our 40 acres and a mule Lincoln promised us?
Well, it's interesting. Very quick response to that is that between January of 1865 and April of 1865, which was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, some 400,000 acres of land were actually distributed to some 40,000 freedmen. Of course, with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, his successor, Andrew Johnson, took all of that land that had been distributed by Sherman and others and gave it back to the plantation owners that actually owned the slaves that they were supposed to be giving the land to. So again, I think part of this is us really trying to read and understand history. And I think that most people would be very surprised at the linkages that even now exist with regards to the enrichment of insurance companies. One of the things I've learned is how Africans in this country, almost every major railroad in this country, and they are being sued right now in Chicago federal court, were built by Africans, literally what they call convict labor as well as slave labor for little or nothing. It was not all Africans worked on plantations, but plantation owners actually lent their slaves to railroad companies so that they could be built.
2 emails. There is no raging debate on reparations in this country. It will never happen. This country has no responsibility to hand out money to black people. What you should be doing is working on cutting the rate of black children born out of wedlock, cutting down on crime of black people, seeing that black children have a father and a mother in a home, and seeing that every black child gets a good education. That from a viewer in Arizona, and also this from Laura Marriott, who says, please ask Mr. Windbush if he really believes handing money to some blacks will end the out-of-wedlock births, STD high rates, sexually transmitted diseases, especially for HIV/AIDS, which blacks account for 50% of all cases, and other black-on-black crimes.
Well, I'm really struck by the fact when people write letters like that and say things like that. What's amazing is how we could go to Northern Ireland right now and talk about Catholics and how they are just irresponsible people. Or if it would be like going to Kosovo right now, or for that matter, something even more relevant, Iraq right now, said these people are just lazy, they don't know how to run their country, they have out-of-wedlock births, and look at their economy, it's all in shatters. Not understanding history. And I'm not a historian, but I know for a fact that anybody who reads a good book on black history in this country will understand why the conditions in the African American community are the way they are now. But most people simply have not done that. I, as an African American, have had to read about George Washington throwing dollars across the Delaware River, or how Lincoln freed the slaves supposedly. But I was not required to know who Marcus Garvey was. I was not required to learn who Martin Delany was. And most white Americans don't have to read anything about African and American history. And I think that's something that does them a disservice.
Last call from Garberville, California. Good morning.
Yes, sir, Mr. Windbush. I guess I would support reparations, except for the idea that two points. The gentleman earlier mentioned other slave trading nations, most of them European, but the truth is there was also Africans involved with the slave trade, and there was Africans that had slaves themselves. It wasn't only white people. And another point that's a really major one is, what about, it wasn't like you said, supposedly Lincoln that freed the thousands of them, including my ancestors who died, who didn't own slaves at all.
Yeah, the best answer I could give is that, and it's the truth, was, of course there were Africans who owned slaves. There were indigenous people who scouted for Custer at Little Bighorn. I recently saw the film The Pianist, in which Jews, as we know, helped place people in the Warsaw Ghetto. And we know that there were some Japanese Americans who helped process their own fellow countrymen during their incarceration during World War II. But certainly we wouldn't blame Jews for the Holocaust. We wouldn't blame the slaughter of Indians on Sioux. And we certainly wouldn't blame Japanese for their incarceration. So why should we blame Africans for their own enslavement? The fact of the matter is that European chattel slavery was going to happen with or without the cooperation of a tiny minority of Africans on the continent. And so I think this is a straw man when we raise arguments such as that.
What happens next?
What happens next is that there's going to be a series of lawsuits that are going to be taking place at the government as well as the corporate level. I hope to see Congressman Congress Bill H.R. 40 pass, and I think that you're going to continue to see the movement grow even bigger than it is right today.
Dr. Windbush is the editor of this publication, Should America Pay? Slavery and the Raging Debate on Reparations.